you have to respect your parents. Like, I think if I did what most of my friends here did, you'd get a literal short end of the stick.
Yes, yeah.
We are the country that has the biggest archipelago. It's very multicultural. It has the most languages in the world. It's also the only country that has a Muslim majority that's a democracy. Our desserts, we have martabak. That's our most famous one. It's practically diabetes on a plate. It's like...
Nice. Hello everyone, welcome to the Orbital Media Podcast, where we learn about the people of the world, what they do, and their cultures, one interview at a time. Today we're going to be talking about Indonesia, and we are joined by Michelle Sastra Amaja.
Yes.
How close did I come on that?
That's pretty close.
Okay. Michelle, could you tell us a little bit about maybe who you are and kind of your background, and then we'll get into the topic of Indonesia and sort of what it means to be from that country.
Yes, so I'm a filmmaker from Indonesia. I was born there, I grew up there. My dad is of Chinese Indonesian descent and my mom is of like Javanese descent. So I have like that Javanese influence, but I grew up in the Sundanese culture. It's a big archipelago.
And we'll get into what all of those terms mean.
Yes.
And we can do that now. So Indonesia is a country that I know where it is on a map and I know kind of what it looks like, but to generalize, I would imagine a lot of Westerners you might find don't know a whole lot about Indonesia. They're often not familiar with it as a country. So if you were talking to someone for the first time, you say, right, I'm from Indonesia, and they say, okay, that's a country, maybe we've heard of it. What would you sort of follow that up with?
I would say we are the country that has the biggest archipelago. It's very multicultural. It has the most languages in the world, thus cultures also. And also, it's also the only country that has a Muslim majority that's a democracy.
Where is it in the world, and kind of what are these islands? It's made up of a lot of different islands.
Yes, so there are, I believe, 4 major islands. That would be Java, Bali, Sumatra, and then Irian, which is also shared with the country of Papua New Guinea. And then we also have Bali, and then we have a few like minor islands all around. And
there's Borneo and, did you say Sumatra?
Sumatra.
The main population, right? So I guess to back up, who lives, this is a hard question, right? But like, who lives in Indonesia? The answer is a lot of people, but like...
So like the majority of the population is Javanese. They mostly take over the middle of Java and the kind of like the East Java. They're all Javanese, they speak one language. And then in the island of Java, the second biggest population would be the Sundanese. Kind of like my people where we grew up, and that's West Java.
So these are two different populations that both live on the island of Java.
Yes.
And the island of Java, right, is sort of, it's long and thin, and it's in the lower half. It's sort of like the bottom island chain, but that's where the vast majority of people live, right? It's like a very, very, very heavily populated island.
It's the most populated landmass in the world.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, right. So let's, I guess, go through the geography. We've got Java. It's this thin, extremely heavily populated island in like the southern part of Indonesia. Then we've got Bali, which I'm sure is probably an island that a lot of Westerners know about. What can you tell us about Bali?
Bali is Indonesia's majority Hindu state and island. It's also the remnant of probably the last of the Majapahit Empire, which is the great empire of Indonesia back in like the 1600s. And yeah, that's kind of, they have that unique Hinduism that's kind of different from India, but it is what they say, the land of paradise. It's a beautiful place.
Do you know anything about Borneo or Sumatra, like the big ones?
Yes, Borneo is mostly national park. There are a few people there, mostly Christians. And Sumatra is also another area where there's a lot of people. It's the second most populated after probably Java. That has like a bunch of people group from like the Dayaks. Is that
an ethnic group? The Dayaks?
That's an ethnic group.
Okay.
And also they live in that island, and that's a mix of multi-religion too. It's Islam and Christianity. There's the majority, but it's a different form of Christianity and Islam too. It has a very like animistic aspects of it. If you, it's kind of closer like how Catholicism in South America is different than Catholicism is in like Europe. That's the same kind of like Islam in Indonesia, even more in like the Sumatra area.
Yeah, I want to definitely get into religion in a second without kind of rocking the boat too much, but still kind of, asking certain questions. But I still want to get into some of these islands. So there's the half of the island of New Guinea, right, that is, it's like there's a line down the middle, there's the island of New Guinea that the western half is part of Indonesia. And is that mostly inhabited by Papuan people or?
Yes, okay. Mostly Papuan. There's a few kind of Javanese that got moved by the government, I believe in the 60s and 70s, but mostly Papuan.
Okay.
There, yeah.
And then what's the climate like?
It's tropical, just almost one season rain, and occasionally you get like a period of 3 months where you get maybe rains instead of like 3 days a week, you get it once a week.
Okay. So it is very rainy, it's very tropical,
yeah.
It's very hot. Very humid. And it sounds like it rains a lot throughout most of the year.
Yeah.
And is it the summer that's less rainy or is it winter? Or?
It's kind of more like so when it's summer in Australia, it's less rainy. Yeah.
So that would be
December.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Because I got to remember it's not north. It's you guys are around the equator, so it's sort of like saying the seasons of like winter, spring, like don't really apply so much. It's like rainy season is December, January, kind of, or that's the relatively drier season.
Yeah.
And then the other times of the year are quite rainy. So I'm very curious to talk a little bit about the culture and sort of the life in Indonesia growing up. Now, I don't know how you want to approach this, if there's any aspects of culture, but I always like starting with things like food and drink. We can also, if you want to tell us or tell the audience what we're drinking here. I can't show you, unfortunately. You have to just take my word for it that this is a cup of coffee. Michelle, would you like to explain?
So this is the way kind of like a lot of Indonesians traditionally drink their coffee. It's called kopi tubruk. So you ground the coffee till like it's powder. Then you just pour hot water and let it seep and let it kind of drop to the bottom. And you kind of just drink the water on the top. Okay. That's traditional.
So that's what we're drinking now. I find that it's quite chewy because there are a lot of coffee grounds that are like sort of floating around in the water, which gives it an interesting drinking experience. So let's talk about food and drink. So there's coffee, obviously, for drink. What else would be very popular beverages?
There's jamu, which is a traditional kind of Indonesian concoction where you just mix a lot of like kind of herbs, like natural herbs people find, kind of sometimes like roots, plant roots. It's almost like a natural remedy. Yeah. But like usually people say like, oh, eat it if you have a cold, drink it. Yeah.
Okay. So it's sort of a herbal remedy. You have coffee. What about tea? Is it
tea? My area, yeah. Okay. We're the tea growers. We originally, even our city is founded as like kind of tea holiday destination for the Dutch, and but we drink our tea just plain. My mom's area, they drink it with a lot of sugar, and then some areas they'll put like fruits in it.
Is tea, because this isn't true for all countries, but it does seem that there's often this idea where if in a culture people are really big into coffee, they're often less into tea, and vice versa. If they're really into tea, people seem to be less into coffee. Do you find that that's the case much in Indonesia, or is it like people kind of just drink both?
They drink both. Okay. So like coffee is very important in Indonesia. That's where they come like Java cup.
Yes, of course, right. A cup of Java.
Of Java.
Coming from Indonesia,
then they also love their tea. It's almost like, it's strange, but they'll drink their tea like during lunchtime, and sometimes like early in the morning, and then they'll drink their coffee at night. So coffee shops are open late.
Why? Do you have a sense of why people might do that? Why might they drink coffee so late?
I'm not sure, but it's like, I think it's the culture of like, it kind of replicated from that revolutionary time where they would meet in coffee shops because a lot of the founding fathers were Muslim and they can't drink alcohol, and that's usually like where bars, they have ideas, and instead they kind of went to coffee shop. It's almost like the French Revolutionary, same thing, coffee shops became big, and it just carried on, especially in university
Of
towns.
staying up late and drinking coffee and
Yeah.
Okay. Huh. Yeah, I mean, over here the sense is people are always coffee is a huge sort of morning drink,
Yeah.
right? And kind of the U.S. candidates is very much heavily associated with the morning. I personally actually enjoy drinking it often in the afternoon, the evening, but I think culturally it's associated with the morning. It's not like a nighttime or an evening drink. Food, I love talking about food,
Yes.
and I've had Indonesian food a couple times in my life. I've not had it a lot. But can you tell people, obviously the country's very big, so there's going to be a very wide, diverse range. But if we were taking sort of, the type of Indonesian food you'd find if you went into an Indonesian restaurant in a city, in like the Netherlands, which we'll talk about, or, Southern California or New York or whatnot, or Sydney, Australia.
So our national dish has to be the nasi goreng. It's
Okay.
Indonesian fried rice, which I think is, other people might criticize me, but it's the best fried rice out there. We use sweet soy sauce, not salty, and I just kind of mix it with egg and chicken, and it's usually like a lot of sambal, which is our chili, and yeah, that's probably the go-to. And usually we also add rendang, which even Anthony Bourdain voted as one of the best food he's ever eaten in his life.
And what is that?
It is beef, like a hard part of a beef that they practically stew in curry for hours.
Okay, and then it gets sort of like falling off the bone.
Yeah.
And kind of nice. What about rice toffel? Is that something?
Rice
So there's obviously a lot of
Yes.
connotations to that, but is that something that people eat still in Indonesia, or is that viewed as like this colonial thing and we don't do that? Because
So ristafel was invented in my hometown, Bandung.
Okay.
So the Dutch people invented that. It never really went away, but it was like it fell out of popularity, and like probably around the 70s to the 2000s. But it kind of went back in popularity early, and I don't think it's because they associated it with colonialism. I think it's just like the fast food chains became more popular, and then like it's kind of a huge meal to present, so people don't do that so often, and restaurants kind of concentrate on more Western or Japanese cuisines, and so it wasn't until recently that it got like repopularized.
And to tell people what rice toffel is.
Oh yes, ristafel is practically a bunch of like different type of food in small plates, like tapas.
Yeah.
Practically.
And like, what would be some of the popular examples of what people might have?
So there'll be like the yellow rice called nasi kuning, which is made from like cooking rice with this yellow type of root. I don't know what it is in English. I don't think you can find it.
Well, what would it be called in?
I don't remember.
Okay, all right. A mystery yellow root. A mystery
I think
yellow
it's
root.
turmeric. I'm pretty
Turmeric.
sure.
It could be turmeric. Yeah. I mean, that's
yeah.
a very yellow colored. Yeah. thing.
Yeah, something like that. And then you have rendang, of course. You have our fried chicken.
Okay. Fried chicken.
Fried chicken, but
Okay.
it's not like KFC. It's slightly battered, but not really.
What about Korean? How does it compare to Korean fried chicken?
Different.
Different,
Korean's
okay.
Western.
Yeah,
Ours
it is what. Yeah, it
is-
is Western. So it's not battered the same way.
It's not. They kind of have like a potato, not potato, I mean coconut, sorry. Brain fart. Yeah, coconut starch that they kind of use on top to kind of fry it a bit. But the chicken itself is not battered. It's more like soaked in coconut sauce.
And then what about the? I'm trying to think of like dishes that I've had before, but it's only been a couple times, and it's been like several years ago. And there was stuff with, was it not hard-boiled egg, but something?
Yes, we do a lot of like hard-boiled egg with chili, hard-boiled egg with kind of like the turmeric sauce, and then with curry. We have so many versions of those, but that always is included in a ristafel.
What, in terms of the curries, like what does, because I mean, I quite enjoy it, but I don't know a whole lot about, other than just the different colors, the intricacies of curry and that.
So our curry is pretty closely related to India's curry. A lot of Indians migrated to Indonesia like back before the Dutch colonization time, and so that's the influence. So pretty much it's like coconut milk with kind of curry powders, and there's like the yellow curry powder, the red curry powder. I'm not like sure what's inside. You just usually buy the
the color.
color.
What's the color? Yeah. Yeah. So yellow, green, not so much.
No, Thailand has a lot of
That's
green
more green,
curries.
okay.
Yeah, we have green chilies.
Got it. Okay. So green chilies, that's more Thailand. Yellow and red is more kind of India, Indonesia.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Any other kinds of food, like also like desserts and stuff like that?
Desserts. Our desserts, we have martabak. That's our most famous one. It's practically diabetes on a plate. It's like a bunch of butter and sugar pancake dough, and then you put make it really thick. There's the thin ones, but famous ones are really thick. And then you put chocolate, nowadays like Toblerone and Oreos and whatever you want, and then you fold it into it. It was kind of born actually from the Middle Eastern martabak, which is salty and way more thin, but I guess they innovated with it.
And they just said we just want it to be all sugar and sugar and butter, basically.
Yeah.
You're just like it's sugar and butter.
Yeah, sugar and butter and like cheese. I had a teacher come from the States, got addicted to that, and it did not do well. Whereas
did they gain a tremendous amount of weight?
Yes, eating those every day practically.
Other than sort of certain national dishes, but like, do you have a favorite?
Martabak's one of my favorite. I love the kind of Indonesian tea times desserts and kind of snacks, which is like rissoles, croquettes, bitterballen. They're mostly like Dutch influence.
Those sound very Dutch. Yeah, bitterballen, like basically fried balls with cheese or doughy kinds of things inside of them.
And those dried like kind of people here think they're like really hard dry cookies, but in the Netherlands, Indonesia, they love them. And so I like those like stroop waffles.
Those are slowly catching on here, but they're still pretty artisanal. But a good stroop waffle with a cup of coffee,
it changes everything.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Outside of food, what about whether it's and this is from your time living here and seeing differences, things like whether it's family life or like social life, like what do you find like might do for fun?
For fun in Indonesia, I think in Indonesia for fun they like talking, spending quality time is really important with your friends. Like you would like go with your family to have lunch, dinner, teas, cafes. We have a lot of cafes. It's mostly one of the reasons like it's so popular is people go to hang out and talk. Like sometimes in the US it feels like you have to do like every event. Like you have to go to a club, you have to go hiking. Rarely like even when you sit down at a restaurant you feel rushed. Like you have to get out in like an hour and then the table goes to the next person. And you just kind of more relaxed. Like you just keep on ordering little by little drinks, food, and you spend the day getting to actually know the person.
That's kind of interesting. I mean this idea of right, how I even phrase that, saying like, oh, what do you do for fun, suggesting, oh, it must be an activity. Like, what are the activities that you have to do? But, right, this idea of actually we just talk to people. We just sit down and we like to just chat with people.
Yeah.
And that's our main, what we do. Yeah.
Because I feel like my friends here are more lonely than the ones back home, because like they're always saying like, oh, my family doesn't understand me, we don't talk. I think that's like that lack of communication, which I think in Indonesia it's like more like, oh, we talk, at least if you're not to your parents, your friends will sit.
That's actually, I want to talk more about that, the sort of the loneliness epidemic, which is something I think people are starting to talk about a little bit but really in Western developed countries is where you see it. You don't seem to hear about this quite the same way in other places. In your experience, is that A, true in your time in the US, and B, do you find that's less of a problem in Indonesia? Partly because of this culture of people they like to talk to each other.
Yeah, I think in the US my friends feel like they have to create kind of like that filter, kind of like, oh, I have to look, especially maybe in LA or New York, that's where most of my friends are, like, I have to look this certain level of success. I have to look, like, in Indonesia there are that, like, people want to show, but at least they usually have one or two person they can kind of talk to, maybe because they live at home. Most people still live with their parents until they're married. But also just because people do take the time to sit and listen, so at least you're not carrying all the burden in your life. You have some person has this, knows this part of my struggle, another person might know. One aspect.
So there's a little bit less in the sense of having to keep up appearances and pretend like everything's great all the time. Would that be fair to?
I think it's more like life is slower, but also like you don't. People love Indonesians love keeping up their appearance. That's definitely true. Actually, more than here. But I don't think they don't struggle for like, hey, I want to hang out because I'm like lonely. Whereas in the US, I think people have a hard time just reaching out to someone and just saying like, hey, I'm lonely, or like, hey, I'm sad. It's not as big of a taboo there.
I see. Okay, so people are more open about, I want to hang out and I feel isolated, I feel alone, and people aren't going to sort of judge them for saying that the same way that, I'm not even sure everyone would do that here, but yeah, there would be maybe a little bit of a sense of like, oh, what, you don't have any friends? Like, what's wrong with you? Like, oh, you're probably weird. Like, I don't want to hang out with you.
Yeah. And there it's not. Like, if someone's like, hey, this person just moved in, they want a friend, then someone's going to reach out. Even like the Indonesian community here. You're new in the US, you want a community, you want friends, then we'll help you out and we'll reach out. Yeah.
But then to go back to appearances, you said when people actually care more about keeping up appearances than in the US, is that in terms of like their job and success, or is it in terms of like literally their clothing and like this is the kind of car that I have, or that kind of thing?
It's more like, oh, this is the clothing, the car.
Yeah, okay.
More for their jobs, it's more like, oh, it's like what your family does.
Yeah.
Because it is more of a we culture, not an I.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's actually something I'm curious about. The idea of like markers of success. Are there, I don't know, certain types of jobs or certain lifestyles or career paths that are more prestigious than others that you feel are different than what exists in like the US or like a typical Western country? Yeah,
in Indonesia, a lot of people see success in kind of like owning a company. So like not working for someone, like being your own boss, which I think is like in the US is a certain aspect, but a lot of people I realize in the US like, oh, they graduate, they want to climb the corporate ladder. Whereas in Indonesia, their concentration is like, there are some like in Jakarta that want to climb the corporate ladder, but a lot of them their goal is to kind of like start their own business. But a lot of people fail, and then they'll go like to corporate.
Yeah, it's really hard. Yeah, I would say in the US it's more, there is a prestige of you work for a big company and it has the name brand and you've got some cool title and you make a whole lot of money, and that's very much seen as sort of, oh, that's like the end goal, that's what you want. The starting your business thing, if you succeed, it's probably seen as better, but if you don't, a lot of people view it as almost worse than if you have like the cool corporate job with all of the benefits and you can tell everyone how many points you get on your Amex, company Amex card and all of that. But would it be almost a sense in Indonesia of, even if you're not maybe that successful, but you have your own business, people view that as like, oh, that's very impressive, even if you're not maybe making as much money as someone who's, they work in an office building somewhere?
I think at first people would go like, oh, let's say, someone works for Nestle in Indonesia. They probably make more than a guy who owns his own restaurant, like a tiny shop. At first they'll think like, oh, okay, the tiny shop guy depends on like if it's a nicer, bougier place, they'll be like, oh, okay, that guy's more successful. And that's more of the image they're trying to project. And that guy might talk like, look, I have my own business, I'm more prestigious, but in the end, the numbers is what counts still, but first view, people in Indonesia would think the guy who owns a business makes more.
It makes more. Okay. So all right. So ultimately it does still come down to the money and what the value, how much money do you make? But there's at least, it sounds like a little bit of a different approach to people being more interested, at least, to strike out and try to make their own way in the world. I wonder if that is maybe changing a little bit in the US. It does seem like fewer people, the younger Gen Z people, seem to be less interested in climbing the corporate ladder. But There, but anyway, not to speak in broad platitudes, but so that's interesting. Anything else sort of like that just like a difference that you've noticed being here, where you'd say, I guess how I want to frame it is, rather than saying like, oh, a difference between Indonesia and the U.S., I'm curious to just know what kind of life is like there, but it might be easier if you say like, so things work this way in the U.S., this is how they work in Indonesia, from how you've seen stuff. And whether it was like family or, like work-life balance, something like that.
Mm-hmm. So in Indonesia, definitely, I think life is slower, family orientation, like family is like most important, I think, to a lot of Indonesians. Like you have to respect your parents. Like I think if I did what most of my friends here did, you'd get a literal short end of the stick.
Yes, yeah. I would, yeah. I'm sort of, yeah.
Yeah, and so I guess that aspect is different, and that kind of leads to work too. Usually, like you work, but you do want to have that usually weekend day off with your family, and then I guess depends on the job. You'll have more balance, but I grew up with a dad that like runs his own company, and so he works almost like 7 days a week. Yeah. So there's that too. But yeah, usually it because the business still usually involves like certain aspect of the family. You're there, and in Indonesia you also like unless you're like working for an international corporation, your kind of employee is seen as family.
Okay. So would it be fair to say that in a lot of cases you have literal just family businesses where family and work are one and the same?
Yeah.
There's not really this distinction between you go to the workplace and then you come back and now you spend a lot of time with your family.
No, yeah.
Okay.
There's usually like at least like aspects, maybe your wife and kids might stay at home and because they're not part of the business. It's different with my family because my mom and dad works, but in a way like it's kind of different from ours too because he doesn't work with his brothers, he's in his own company, but other of my friends whose family business has their uncles, then yeah, you technically hang out with your brother and sisters every day in that family business, and then in the weekend you'll still probably have like brunch with them once.
Right. And I'm assuming it's assumed that as you grow up, one or more of you will take on certain positions in the family company or in the family business, basically.
Yes, and that's usually what leads to collapse. Too many people trying to eat from the same tree. Yeah. So usually better cases, they go professional. And that way people are free to pursue whatever they want. Those are usually the more successful ones.
When you say the more successful ones, you're saying families where not everyone is trying to just stay on the lifeboat that is the dad's business, basically.
Yeah, if not, it's like you get the shares, you get the dividends, you get an inheritance, you can start your own thing. Or none of you guys get to be CEO. Right. We hire a professional CEO. You guys get to pursue and start your own thing. But you do have that wealth from that family. And that's usually how the conglomerates are run by that point, the billion-dollar companies.
Okay. So to delve into this a little bit more, and I think I at this point maybe it does make sense to bring your background into this a little bit because, again, the little I know, it does seem that there are specific aspects of life in Indonesia with like powerful families and well-connected people that are in sort of a certain world, and then there are like a lot of not very wealthy people who make up like a lot of the general population. So your background was, very successful family, right, with like a lot of connections. And if I don't mind, I'm curious to also talk about the overseas Chinese aspect of this because. So you said your father's Chinese by descent. My understanding is that Indonesia is a country where the Chinese make up a very small, very, very small percentage of the population, but they're extraordinarily successful business people, like overseas Chinese in many parts of the world. And that is a very particular culture into itself. Do you want to talk at all about that?
Yeah, so my dad's family, so my dad's dad came from Shanghai. He went away right when Shanghai was falling to the communist party. So right on the nick of time is how he always phrased it. And so.
So that's your grandfather.
Yes.
That's your grandfather on your dad's side. Okay.
My dad's side. So, and then he kind of like made my grandma, and she's also of Chinese descent, but she's been in Indonesia.
She was already living there. Okay.
Yeah.
The family had been.
Her mom has been. Their mom was born in Indonesia, and so on. I think like the Chinese Indonesian community in Indonesia is called Peranakan. And so that's kind of where they grew up. They came to the country with just the clothes on their back, but they were able to climb up because of kind of like colonialism. Like the Dutch did see the Chinese as something that they could use to create kind of like a caste system in Indonesia. And also because the Chinese had bamboo diplomacy, whereas the native Indonesians didn't. So the Chinese Indonesians created kind of this network from Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Hong Kong. They helped each other out. And they kind of grew together in Southeast Asia. And it's something that, fortunately, I guess, kind of like it's also a way for them to show to the colonialism, you can't break us up, you need us, but also no matter how much the Dutch and the English try to break up this kind of bamboo diplomacy, you can't. Because you had to be Chinese.
Yeah, it seems like a very interesting dynamic if you throw in European colonials, you throw in Chinese, and then you throw in sort of native populations in a lot of these areas. It can get very complicated because everyone's kind of their own faction. Everyone kind of wants their own thing. And I'm really interested in the Chinese overseas community in Southeast Asia because I could see, and, not to use certain analogies, but in I'd say Europe, North America, the analogy would be very much Jewish people.
Yes.
Right? That same idea of very small population, very well educated, treated pretty badly for like kind of a long time, but still able to rise up and be very successful, often through networks and people kind of working with each other and like working together. But in that area, there's always a sense of like, the attack could come from any side, right? Like we don't know who could be coming after us next. It could be any one of these groups. With the case of the overseas Chinese, was there a sense of that with like whether it's the European colonialists, whether it's the local Malays, like it could be any of these people could cause problems for us, or is it more of a sense of we really view ourselves as like part of this team and like we don't like these people?
So it's a very complicated history. As time passed, like local Indonesian and like the Chinese kind of struggle between the two has gotten better. Especially with the younger generation, the racism has thinned out. Well, the racism between kind of like we call them the Malay Chinese, like we call Peranakan ourselves, as in Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia. They were all that racism was built by colonialism. They would, originally the Chinese has existed in Indonesia even before Dutch colonialism. They brought Islam to Indonesia actually. And the Indonesians and them had great relationships, and they worked together actually to try to take over the Dutch a few times. And so the Dutch and the English, seeing how they could lose their power in Southeast Asia, began to test out the grounds for kind of like, the Indians stay on this section, the Chinese stay on this section, and the native Indonesians stay in this section, and they can't intermix. And then every time the Dutch messes up, they'll blame it on the Chinese, and they'll open the quarters and let the native fight it out with the Chinese. It was all created systematically, and they later implemented the same tactic in South Africa with the colors and then local blacks, because then like mixed race people and the local African population, and that was the tactic they used, which they learned from Southeast Asia, especially in Jakarta, Batavia, which you can see kind of where the old kind of racial lines used to be.
What about subsequently? So let's say the Dutch leave in the late 50s, early 60s.
Yes.
Subsequently, what's the dynamic between? Because like Malaysia, my impression is things are pretty dicey there. But what about Indonesia?
So Indonesia was dicey all the way till probably late 90s.
Okay.
With them, they had a major kind of riot in 98. But that kind of turned, like not kind of, it turned a little bit dicey for the Chinese, especially in Jakarta. But after that, it's kind of like, that was like the breaking point. I think most of the natives do not agree with what they did to the Chinese in 98 too. And they kind of stood up when kind of that was the moment, kind of like, it's too much.
Okay.
Yeah, and so since then, like, of course, the Chinese and Indonesian, there's a lot of them that have a lot of fear against that, but I think they also have racism among them to the natives. They think they're a little better at times. But with the younger generations, that's fading away, and now there's more intermixing. They don't see themselves, a lot of them, as Chinese anymore. They see as themselves as Indonesian, and the Indonesians integrated them well to society. After the Dutch left, I think it took a while to heal, but I think they followed suit with kind of Singapore's tactics. Singapore integrated the Malays, the Indians, and the Chinese very, very well, and Indonesia is kind of doing the same that.
Okay, yeah, interesting. And with that, would you? I guess not to get sort of personal here. Would you how would you see yourself in all of this then?
I've always seen myself as Indonesian. I have Chinese descent, but foremost, I'm Indonesian.
And you find that's the case for most people sort of your age cohort?
Yeah.
Okay. And what, I mean, I don't know if you know, like the dynamic between Indonesia currently and China actually, just...
We are always like, our policy for Indonesia since a long time is always like, we're trying to hold both hands, hold US and Chinese, never picking one. And ever since the 1960s, when we started doing that, I think it had been especially once, more like on the early 2000s, we really embraced that. It's been working well for us. Like China has been trying to like budge in their power, take over islands, and that's annoying to us. But we also did remember when we sided too much to the US, what they did to us in the 60s and 90s. Was not very nice. Like there's the Jakarta method. It's a book and also a method used by the CIA that they started in Indonesia, which is to create a Red Scare and mass murder. And then they copy pasted it in Chile, Argentina. And so, of course, there's distrust, but most of the time I think Indonesia's politician has been doing well by straddling both.
It sounds similar to from what I've heard about the Philippines, where they essentially are, and maybe less so Vietnam for a while, but I think Vietnam's kind of decided to go on the US team. But it's sort of we're going to try to just not pick any team. We're just going to do whatever we can to stay in the middle and get on with things. Yeah, I mean, so the history of Indonesia, to like do a really quick run through, the basics that I got is you've got archipelago, you have mostly like Hindu people who kind of show up first, then kind of Islam takes over, then the Dutch kind of show up and they control like Java basically, and mostly just that for a long time, and then eventually and then you've got like some sultanates and stuff, and they're like kind of fighting with each other. The Dutch end up taking up the whole archipelago, the modern borders of the nation by like late 1800s, early 20th century. They then run that as like their main colony. The Japanese invade that. Japanese control Indonesia for like a couple of years. Then they're sort of beaten back. The Dutch, like the French, kind of try to hold on to the islands. Doesn't work out. They kind of pack up and leave. And then I'm trying to remember who the leader is. He has like it's like a really short name.
Oh yeah, Suharto.
Yeah, okay. And then Indonesia tries to kind of get on the same team as like India and like Egypt, and they try to build out the whole like third world coalition thing, which like kind of founders through the late 20th century. And then, yeah, you mentioned there's sort of a whole like Red Scare, anti-communist thing that goes on in the 70s and 80s. Then I don't actually, and then in recent decades, there's sort of issues with secularism versus Islamism is my impression is like a major issue right now,
Yeah.
like currently in the country. And that's kind of what I got. Are there any other things that like would be, I don't know?
No, I think the current struggle with now is just like, I think like people are always like have that association in the US with Islam and terrorism. But what's happening in Indonesia with secularism, and if you change Islam to religion, it's like what's happening here with kind of like one group wants to be super secular, and then one group wants the old Christian hardcore, which is actually not that different from Islam hardcore. And so I think it's what's happening all over the world. It's what's happening here.
It seems, the sense I have from Indonesia is it's sort of like Turkey in a way, where if you had maybe the secularists running the country rather than being in the political minority, where they're running the country and they're maintaining a democracy. But yeah, there's sort of this issue of, as you said, people who are very religious and then the people who are not and they don't want the country to be religious, and there's sort of a like a point of contention there.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, better than other countries that I know of where it's like, no, pretty much the religious people run everything. That's not the case in Indonesia. It's more like
Yeah, I think the religions, people who are very religious and conservative in Indonesia is actually a minority, but very loud minority,
Okay.
I would say. Because if you would talk to a person on the street, they wouldn't want that. And that's anywhere, all through like Java, Bali.
Yeah. Is it, and I'm trying to remember a map that I was looking at, like, is it parts of Sumatra where you have like some really like religious people?
Yes, Aceh. And so they
That's
want
what it
to
is.
break
Okay.
away from the country.
Yeah, because I remember I looked at a map and it was sort of, the colors of like secularism and like crazy religion things, and Indonesia was pretty much all the color of a secular place, but there was this one little patch on like the tip of Sumatra that was the color of like, yeah, they have Sharia law there or something like that.
Yes.
I was like, oh, what's up with that?
They kind of got their own. Indonesia fought a civil war with them, and then they got their own kind of like state rights, like usually only given to the sultanates. Like only one part of the other country is Jakarta, but very kind of secular. But practically they just wanted to keep their sultan. And where in that area they kind of wanted Sharia law. So they were allowed to.
And so if you asked, right, like a person on the street in Jakarta, like what would people view that as, like, yeah, those are some like people we don't really deal with who like they're in our country but people don't go there, and like
people, I think if you go to Aceh itself, they do have a very conservative culture, but it's like, as long as you abide by that, they're not gonna like punish you, treat you unfairly, or like it's totally like Afghanistan over there.
Well, we hope it's not.
It's not. Yeah, it's like it's Sharia law, but not to the extreme, I guess, is the working. But people that's not the common. No one wants to live like that. No one wants to be forced to abide by it.
Right.
And so most Indonesians wouldn't want that, but they would probably consider that, well, I heard it's like that, but I've never been there. It's not exactly, there's not like a popular cultural area you have to visit there. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know, obviously we could look it up, but what is the religious breakdown in Indonesia in terms of, I know it's Muslim majority.
And then it's like second is Christian.
It's Christian, okay.
And then Catholics, and then Hindus. So yeah, it's a Muslim majority country, but it's not a majority, whereas it's like in the Emirates.
Right, yeah, it's not like one of the places where it's like a theocracy. And I mean, your sense, just again from like living in Jakarta and kind of people's interactions with each other, did you ever feel that, like, what the sort of the dynamic was between different religious groups? Or I don't know about Jakarta specifically, like is it like very heavily Muslim, or because it's the major city, is it like a rather religiously diverse, and because people are coming from all over? And
in Jakarta, like I grew up in Bandung, but I go to Jakarta often. It's majority Muslim, but also there's so many other religions. Like Christianity is pretty big among the Chinese community, and Catholicism, and also the Batak people. There's a lot of people who immigrated from Sumatra. there, and they're mostly like Catholics and Christians.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I think Jakarta would be, I'm guessing, on par, maybe a little higher Muslim population than Indonesian as a whole demographic. But again, like in Indonesia, most people never make religion an issue. Like a lot of my parents' friends, like have like interreligion couples, and they just like let their kids choose when they grow up, and it's never really like. I'm sure some people make it like a strain in their family, but for the most part, like I have Muslim friends, I have Hindu friends, I have Christian friends. It has never been an issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. And then in terms of, you'd mentioned at the beginning, sort of, there were like two major ethnic groups that live on the island. Or what are dynamics like that? What are dynamics sort of between different groups, like in that sense?
So like any other place when there's like two different groups, they like to poke fun at each other, of course. And sometimes if you're like really old and conservative, you don't like your kids marrying into the other one. But again, nowadays it's mostly people don't care and they do it as a joke. But like where I grew up were mostly Sundanese. So like back when during the Majapahit era, before Islam was a majority, so like way in the 1400s, I believe, they came over to our kingdom, the Javanese people, and killed the Sundanese princess, and so there was always like that bitter contentions among the older generations, even though it's like hundreds, 800, 600 years ago.
And more recently, was that sort of like still a case where for a while people kind of haven't cared, or was it like up until pretty recently there was still sort of like contention, again, whether it was on like history or religion?
Not really. They have the same religion. I think it's more like sometimes there are contentions almost like, it's almost like poking fun, like, oh, you guys talk funny, we sound better. Or like, oh, you guys are, there's a bit of colorism in Indonesia, so like the Javanese tend to be darker than the Sundanese. The Sundanese is like, oh, you're dark, we're lighter. Or, they poke fun at certain things, but not, because like if you're in Bandung, Sundanese is the majority. And so the incoming people are Javanese. They just see them like, oh, you're trying to migrate and take our jobs. But over the generations, they don't really care. Yeah.
And those are two. Would those be like the two biggest ethnic groups? My sense is the Javanese are, I think, the largest ethnic group in Indonesia. Okay.
Sundanese is actually, I don't think we're number 2. I think we're like, might be number 4 or 5, but in Java we're number 2.
Got it.
Yeah.
And would that result in that group then having fairly outsized influence in the country?
Yes, in politics, everyone is Javanese, and that's why one of the contentions in my hometown of Bandung, they never vote a Javanese governor.
Got it. Okay.
They always vote a Sundanese because they're like, at least in our local government, we will have a say. Because they're all Javanese, like the president, the vice president, most of the ministers. That just kind of like, because during the Revolutionary War, it started in kind of like the Javanese community.
Okay. Are you familiar with some of the other ethnic groups and kind of like where they live? And
Yes, Batak is in Sumatra, and then there is Balinese. And then there is Bugis people, and I believe Borneo. There's so many.
Right. Now, obviously, I'm not saying we don't have to go through like all like 50 of them or all 100, but kind of the big ones, the big groups. But because the Javanese and the Sundanese, they both live on Java, the Javanese being the dominant one in terms of politics and just like new numbers and location, but the Sundanese having reasonably outsized influence as well. And then what about, you mentioned the people on Bali, what were they? Are they
Balinese?
Balinese, they are Balinese, okay. Again, I've never been to Bali, but I know it's like, kind of this tourist spot. How do they, being that they're this Hindu island, like how do they kind of factor into the rest of the country?
And they get to run kind of their state because it's kind of like they have provinces, not really state, but they have their kind of own jurisdiction. So in Bali, it's a Hindu province, so they kind of just rule on like there's a federal government that's more powerful than the U.S. federal government, but they let states kind of provinces run themselves since the Hindus have Hindu governors, Hindu everything. They let any religion come, but so the culture is still very Balinese. Like they have their parades. They can close the roads, do the parades. Beautiful, and yeah, so they have their own thing and they want to maintain it. I think their biggest fear is not only it's getting like that culture diminished, not only by like Indonesians coming from outstate, but I think that's like a minor issue for them. Most Indonesians respect the Balinese culture when they come in, but also kind of the Western. That's I think what they're more worried about, trying to destroy their cultural elements.
Yeah, I could imagine that would be you essentially have the issue of the West, and then you have the issue of sort of the Java majority, and you put those two things together, and it's like, yeah, we want to preserve our island. Yeah. I'm curious actually about the government, right? Because you mentioned it's a federal system. Right, and really quick, a federal system, for those who don't know, it's where the local regions have some autonomy in how they make decisions. The United States is a federal state. For example, China is not. China is a unitary state, meaning everything has to be done in the capital. France is also a unitary state, but Indonesia is a federal state. And so how does that kind of work in terms of, I don't know, just like, I don't know much about the Indonesian government or how this kind of stuff works.
So they have a way stronger federal than, the federal government way stronger
than the US.
US. But let's say,
how so?
Like if they pass any law in this, like, you know how in here you pass a federal law, like you can sue from the state Supreme Court.
Yep.
In Indonesia, there's only one Supreme Court, so there's no province Supreme Court.
Got it.
So, but there's like the governor of a Java can pass a law, let's say, that is only going to be implemented in West Java-ish area. You can't like pass like, let's say, you're allowed to use weed in West Java. Let's say you can't do that. That has to be passed federally. Where in the U.S. you can, but you can do like, okay, in this system, the schools are gonna teach this instead of that, or like the workers' rights are this and that. So more on like minor, like what they would, I guess, like provincial issues.
So it's federal, but it's a more centralized federal state than the U.S.
It's more like the original U.S. system they had right after independence, before George Washington became.
The argument with the U.S. would be actually the reverse. That the U.S. historically had a very weak federal government, and what's happened is over the decades, or even over the centuries now, the federal government has become progressively stronger and stronger and stronger, with even more. That's totally fine. With even more centralization, but even you're saying relative to where the U.S. is now, Indonesia is still a more centralized federal government. Okay. Right, because like with the U.S., you might have major hot button things like abortion and guns and weed, and that's going to be like, that will be a state by state issue. Obviously, the abortion thing is very controversial. We're not going to talk about that, but because until recently it was national. But guns and drug use and that kind of stuff, very very state based. Even like income tax and stuff. Like that's all. Whether it's a city or a state, that's all state designated, but it sounds like Indonesia, it's more, as you said, it's more minor stuff.
Income state, I believe, province have control over that.
They do. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So each province can increase certain taxes.
Okay. And what about in terms of because it's a democracy? What's sort of like the political party situation there? Like, what parties are the big ones, and kind of?
So originally, Indonesia had kind of the party system like Germany. At first. Till 2006, so where the majority party voted the president, and they have like over 10 parties. Now Indonesia has similar to the U.S., except we still have those 10 parties.
Got it. Okay. So people vote directly for the president.
Yeah.
Okay.
But this one in Indonesia, it's like directly. There's no like electoral. So
Got it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I mean, well, yeah. I was going to say we vote directly for the president, given that the electoral college is a thing.
Yeah.
But okay, so people vote directly for the president, but you do have like a lot of different political parties.
Yes, so a lot, way more than here.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that does seem to be the norm. I think in most countries, the U.S. actually is kind of more the exception to the rule. But I would assume, like in a lot of these, right, there are 2 to 4 that are like the big ones that people generally are going to vote for.
The big ones, I think, in Indonesia we have 4, arguably 3, because one is kind of waning. Major ones.
And where sort of like, I mean, not to go through a whole rundown of like what are their ideologies, but
so most of them are actually pretty non-conservative. It's more like their ideology for like there's the current party, the Democratic one, and then there's PDIP, and then there's PAN, the more religious one.
Okay.
But overall, their kind of ideology is pretty, other than PAN, maybe PAN's more conservative, Muslim, pretty similar in terms. They're just trying to find like, in Indonesia, it's more like our leader is less corrupt.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, because every country, there are the things that people argue over, right? And in the case of Indonesia, is corruption a big one?
Yeah. Okay. So it's almost like in every election, it's like, I promise you I'm not going to be corrupt, and it's which leader you believe is not going to be corrupt, and it's like, we're not going to be a dictator again. We don't want to go back to like the 90s. Right, okay. And that's pretty much.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned, actually the country was a dictatorship. So when did it shift over from being basically a dictatorship to a democracy?
98, exactly.
98, okay.
In 98, the last dictator abdicated. He put his vice president actually like nicely transitioned it to democracy. Okay,
interesting. And then was it one of these where, again, my sense was sort of in that, kind of post-colonial 1960s, you had sort of a vague sense of a democracy, like, what was the guy's name?
Sukarno, and then after Sukarno, Suharto.
Okay, right. And then, this happens like a lot of these countries, right? You'll then have like a dictator who shows up in the 80s and 90s, and then the country's under like a vaguely military rule for like 20-something years. Yeah. Is that the case for?
Yeah, for our case, it was like Sukarno. He was the first guy who led independence. Okay. Yeah, he's a dictator, but he's popular in a way because he's like George Washington. Sure. Yeah. In a way.
He's like Nasser or something in Egypt. Yeah. He was a contemporary of Nasser. Yeah.
Yeah. He did a lot of. He wasn't, I think, the greatest leader in certain aspect. He had created a mass starvation at one point. Mm-hmm. Not too bad like China, but still not great. Yeah.
Was that like a deliberate thing, or was it more just like mismanagement? Mismanagement. Okay.
I think he tried to change rice with another crop that he thought would grow better. Yeah. And it didn't. Yeah. It wasn't do that. I think he was deep inside. He wanted the best for the country. Mm-hmm. Might not have managed it well, and then he started going to socialism, and then the U.S. took him down, and then replaced him with another dictator. Which is like, if you read the book, it was kind of like all because the CIA was playing God and they weren't very bright, and they created an accident where the actual good leaders got nearly killed or traumatized, and then they were left with one guy who they could use who was very corrupt. And yes, that's Suharto. Yes, that led to he's a smart guy, very smart guy, created a lot of growth in Indonesia, but then kind of bled the country dry towards the end. Okay.
And this was in the 80s and 90s?
90s to 90s. 98 where the economy collapsed.
Okay. My sense is that the economy's done better in the past 20 years or so. Yeah. That it's sort of a lower to lower mid-income country. but I would imagine that development's not evenly spread around the country, that there are areas that are probably much more developed than others.
And development was not spread out at all until our current president. I think he spread it out pretty well. He started kind of growing Sumatra and Borneo. He wants to make the capital. And then kind of like practically dividing the wealth out of Java. And so in recent years, like maybe the last 10 years, we've done pretty well. Yeah. So it just shows like what one good leadership can do.
And what about, I mean, again, this is too technical, but like major elements of the economy, like things that the country's kind of known for in terms of?
Well, one of our biggest export, we do a lot of like textiles. So we import a lot of the kind of like cotton from India, US, Vietnam. You can't import from China because US banned them.
Yeah. Well, it's a complicated topic.
Yeah. So you kind of create that. So we have a huge exports on those. We export a lot of raw kind of like natural resources, including one of the biggest gold mines owned by a US company was got sold to them by a dictator.
Okay, yeah.
And they maintain a hold on it, refuse to let them go.
It does happen.
And that's in Papua.
Okay,
and then we also now have batteries, tin, and everyone seems to want to have a part of it. And I think that's what all the governments in the world are currently right now fighting over in Indonesia.
Interesting.
Is it going to be the US, China, or Europe?
Right, our sources for batteries, basically. Yes. Okay, is India in the mix on that as well? Or?
Indonesia has a great relationship. They're usually on our side.
Yeah, okay. So that's still sort of a dynamic that's present then where, I was kind of curious, other than Western countries, like you mentioned, Indonesia takes this very neutral, and I always kind of thought of the countries like very neutral in terms of it's not really on anyone's team, it's kind of just its own thing, but except for India, which is, you said the countries do like each other.
Yeah, Indonesia and India have a great relationship, and I think most of the time, like that's one of our consistent trading partners. I think it's also like pretty much in the same boat. They're both like an upcoming middle to lower middle country, trying to climb up. And I think if you don't create a buddy system, you'll just get squished by the big powers. Yeah. And like Indonesia now just wants factories to be built so that our natural resources are processed in Indonesia instead of exporting it, and the processing system is what creates the wealth. Okay. But like China's willing to invest some factories. US instead criticizes us sometimes, saying like we're not siding enough with us because they want a lot of the money. Same with European Union. So we just go with whoever
is the best option at the time. Yes. Yeah. Well, that's the India-Indonesia connection's an interesting one. I don't know too much about it, but I mean, I could see that again, just going back to the 60s, I know that they were sort of the two of the big players in that, like we're trying to build the third world coalition. Obviously for reasons for why it didn't work. You have too many different groups of people who kind of don't, like, you're only putting them in a room together because we're not something, not we have anything in common with each other. But it's interesting that does seem to have stuck to some degree, at least, between those two countries. Yeah. Because I suppose they are in similar positions in some way. My sense is India's more, I don't want to say aggressive, but they're more really trying to make the push for like major global superpower. Indonesia does, to me as an outsider at least, seem more like, we kind of just want to do our thing, and we're not particularly focused on like, we need the best military, we need like the best, it's just like, we're doing our thing.
You don't want to be involved in major wars. You want to continue just growing, living peacefully. I guess that island mindset.
Yes.
Like, you don't attack us, but if you attack us, we'll defend. And kind of like, we don't want to be like carried into this huge war, like kind of like almost like a former colonialism again type of mindset. Like, okay, you get to grow, with the US, but you have to be like Korea and Japan, where if the US say attack this,
Right.
we have to attack.
Yes.
We kind of
yes.
just want to, maybe we won't grow as fast as them, but at least we live in peace.
Yeah, interesting. It's sort of almost going back to that business. You talked about this. People want their independent businesses. You want to just kind of be left alone. Yeah, the island mentality too is an interesting one. I mean, I think of parts of Southeast Asia very much the same. Even like Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, same thing. I don't tend to think of it as countries that are really wheeling and dealing to try to like become some major power that expands and I don't mean territorially in the modern day, but like economically and culturally, and just sort of like we want to be number one. It does seem to be much more of a we kind of just want to live our lives and just sort of do our own thing.
Yeah, we're always like in this mentality. We have everything we need in our country. We have the beaches, we have the natural resources. When we stay put, we can kind of create that natural kind of like domestic market in life and be pretty good. But of course, in this modern age, you can't close yourself. But we don't want to be like drawn into your messes.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And I suppose you find that is the case. I would say that seems to be the case with other neighboring countries in Indonesia as well, but Southeast Asia as a whole, really.
Yeah.
I tend to think of it as versus India, which like I do think of India very much in the same.
I think they have no choice. They're literally attached to the huge continents.
Yeah, there's something about it where they seem to be they want to play the game. And I don't know, is anything else that you'd like to get into before we sort of, I'm just trying to think before we kind of wrap up?
No, I think it's Indonesia is it's a country I love dearly. It's very complicated in aspects, but I think one day it is going to be a major player in the world, being the fourth. But if anyone wants to further delve in the country, I think there's lots of great books on it, like the Jakarta Method, and like a lot of books on like the foundings of Indonesia.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I hope you all enjoyed this episode, learning about Indonesia. Please make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and tune in next week for our next guest, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you.
And take care.